On the 25th of May 2024, news broke that has rocked the warbird community around the globe. While returning to its base at RAF Coningsby, one of the 6 Spitfires operated by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight crashed. Sadly, the accident was fatal. This is the first fatality suffered by the BBMF in its nearly 7-decade history, and it's a rather special organisation. It's made possible by the serving RAF personnel who are posted to the BBMF as ground crew, and by the volunteers who pilot its collection in their spare time. From what I gather, it's an honour to serve with this unit, but it's not always great for your career. This means that the incident is the first loss of a serving RAF pilot in a Spitfire since the 12th of January 1951. On this date, VN310, a Spitfire F-24 serving with number 80 Squadron, was lost over Hong Kong due to bad weather. At the time of recording, it's still unclear what happened to the BBMF Spitfire and whether or not the aircraft can be restored to flying condition again. We also have no news on who was in the pilot seat, and as requested by the RAF, I will simply extend my deepest condolences to the family and move on to the main focus of this video, MK356. I have to admit my complete ignorance about this aircraft's history before the news broke, but as soon as it did come up on my radar, I had to find out more. Like most of the BBMF fleet, MK356 is the genuine article and was used on operations in the Second World War. In fact, 80 years to the day of its loss in this tragic accident, MK356 was over Belgium, where its Canadian pilot, Flying Officer A.J. Horrell, was navigating heavy clouds over Mons, looking for a secondary target to dive bomb with the rest of number 443 Squadron. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, the other pilots who knew MK356, if somewhat briefly, and what happened to her during the war. The story of MK356, and I will be saying that quite a lot in this video, as with many of her sister Spitfires, started at Castle Bromwich, where she was completed and delivered to 9 Maintenance Unit based at Cosford on the 4th of February 1944. On the 11th of March 1944, the aircraft was sent to number 443 Squadron, which was actually the renamed number 127 Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron, newly arrived in the ETO. She was given the squadron code 2 Item Victor. This has made my research a bit tricky, but more on that later. MK356 didn't take part in the squadron's first operational mission on the 13th of April 1944, which involved escorting light bombers to Dieppe, but it was in action the next day. Along with 11 other Spitfires, MK356 participated in a low-level fighter swoop near Paris in the early afternoon, and then participated in an unsuccessful air-sea rescue mission in the evening. The ORB explains the dinghy the flight was sent out to circle was found to be abandoned by the rescue boat below. MK356 was being flown on both sorties by the same pilot, Flying Officer G.F. Ockenden. Despite the Spitfire never being assigned to a single pilot, Ockenden is the man most associated with MK356. In fact, he would fly subsequent 2 Item Victors taken on by the squadron. Again, that code has made all of this a bit of a headache. This Spitfire is said to have participated in no fewer than 60 operational missions by some online sources. I've been able to identify at least 26 myself, but that's mainly because the scans of the 443 Squadron's ORB, which are available for free on the National Archives website, are blurry at best. I guess you get what you pay for. Of those 26 sorties, which are clearly flown by MK356, Ockenden was in the pilot seat 9 times. Number 443 Squadron, along with numbers 441 and 442, made up the number 144 Royal Canadian Air Force Wing. During April and May 1944, the wing was involved in various tasks, from escorting light bombers across France and Belgium to dive bombing bridges and marshalling yards, as well as no-ball sites. MK356 was flown on several such missions by various pilots of the squadron. In April, those pilots flew 189 sorties in total. The following month, it was 256. We now know for sure what was to happen in early June 1944, something those boys could only guess at the time. This was a month in which the squadron completed 552 sorties. So what did MK356 do on D-Day and during the build-up to that Great Crusade? It would be Flight Lieutenant D.M. Waltz who flew MK356 on its third operational sortie, which would be one of the more eventful flights it took. This was a fighter sweep led by Wing Commander Johnny Johnson, in which No. 443 Squadron took up the top cover position. The formation was bounced over their patrol area near Lille, and 4 FW-190s were claimed destroyed, one by Squadron Leader McLeod, the CO of 443 Squadron. Flight Lieutenant McLennan also got in a few good bursts on a 190, but couldn't continue the attack due to a hung-up drop tank. We will meet McLennan again a little later. Waltz apparently didn't get a sausage during this trip. Nevertheless, he would claim his own victory on an early morning sweep on the 16th of June, a 109 south of Saint-Croix-sur-Mer. This was his second with the unit, the first being an FW-190 shot down on the 24th of April. However, during the evening mission, No. 443 Squadron lost 4 pilots from its roster, 3 being killed. All but one of the men, Flying Officer Luis Perez Gomez from Mexico, had previously taken MK356 to war. The RAF lost 13 men that day killed in action. 1 was taken prisoner and 2 evaded the enemy. Waltz was one who managed to escape the Germans. With the help of the local French population, sometimes reluctantly, he was eventually taken to a place of safety. He posed as a deaf and dumb husband of a local French woman and spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines before linking up with American troops and returning to No. 443 Squadron. It's actually a really interesting story, and I will leave a link to a great little website where I found more information about this escape. Very interesting. On the 24th of February 1945, Waltz was shot down again while attacking flak units, and this time he was unable to evade the enemy. He was released soon when the war in Europe came to an end though. Another man shot down on the 16th and killed was Squadron Leader J.D. Hall, who had flown MK356 on 3 sorties. Hall was attached to 443 Squadron from the end of May 1944 as a supernumerary to gain some up-to-date experience. It was actually his second tour, having been previously attached to 421, 416 and 402 squadrons between April 1942 and June 1943. Shortly before leaving 421 Squadron, after having returned from 402 Squadron to command the former unit, he claimed 1 109 destroyed and another damaged on the 11th of June 1943. Just over a year later, his flight of 6 were bounced by a larger force of FW-190s, and he was shot down and killed. Squadron Leader Hall had flown MK356 during the evening of the 27th of May 1944, where 11 Spitfires were sent to dive bomb targets around Ponthieu. The ORB describes the results as better than the morning sortie that targeted no bullseyes. The next day, Squadron Leader Hall would fly MK356 as part of a fighter sweep over northern France. No enemy aircraft were encountered. Hall would fly another sweep on the 11th of June in MK356, but again, no contact with the enemy was made. So, the squadron shot up a locomotive in an enemy airfield instead. 8 of the 12 aircraft then landed on the crewed landing strips on the beachhead to rearm and refuel, but Hall seems to have returned directly to England with 3 other aircraft. Also lost on the 16th of June was Flight Lieutenant L.H. Russell. He was from Quebec and previously served with 402 and 416 squadrons, the latter as a flight commander. He claimed an FW-190 over Dieppe on the 19th of August and had actually been sent back to Canada in January 1943 to serve in non-operational roles. By October, he was back in Britain and joined 443 Squadron in March 1944. Flight Lieutenant Russell took the controls of MK356 during a mid-morning patrol of the beachhead on the 12th of June. Flying over the Caen-Bayeux sector, all that the 12th Spitfire pilots saw in the limited visibility were 30 well-camouflaged tanks near Mortilly. Another pilot to fly MK356 was Flight Lieutenant I.E. McLennan, who completed an early morning fighter sweep near Paris in the aircraft on the 23rd of May. By the time McLennan joined 443 Squadron in February 1944, he had already claimed 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. His combat career had begun with 610 Squadron 2 years earlier, and he had been posted to 401 Squadron in April 1942. In May, he volunteered to go to Malta and fought with number 1435 Squadron until the end of 1942. However, before McLennan could add to his score, he was shot down near Cabourg on the 7th of June 1944. His engine was hit by flak, and a glycol leak forced him to crash land into a field covered with prepared obstacles. Despite this, he managed to get out of the cockpit and flee the scene. His wingman, Flying Officer Pichier, circled the scene at 100 feet, but was soon driven off by enemy gunfire. McLennan was soon captured and remained a POW until the end of the war. On the same patrol, and flying MK356, was Flight Sergeant G.E. Urquhart. All that I could gather about Urquhart was that he had been with the squadron since he had moved to the ETO, and that he was another Canadian who had flown this BBMF Legend in combat. Other pilots to fly MK356 on ops, if just on a single sortie, were Flight Lieutenant W.A. Prest and Flying Officers W.A. Gilbert, C.E. Scarlett and P.E. Ferguson. Flight Lieutenant Prest was a commander of B-Flight and flew 2 Item Victor on an escort mission to Cambrai on the 7th of May. Prest had been stuck at Manston for 2 days after his engine had sprung a glycol leak during a sortie on the 5th. He only just arrived back with his unit before the mission began. The sortie was uneventful except for some enemy units observed on the ground. This included derelict aircraft on an airfield that were strafed by Flight Lieutenant McLennan to make sure of them. Flight Lieutenant Prest would go on to survive the war. Flying Officer Gilbert, who had been with the unit since November 1943 back in Dartmouth, was at the controls of MK356 on May 13th. Increasingly, the Spitfires of 443 Squadron were being used as fighter bombers. It was a job not every pilot enjoyed, and not one in which all pilots excelled. Don Waltz described how some pilots released their bombs too early in a bid to escape the defensive fire, leading to more than one 500-pounder sailing past his nose while he was still in the bomb dive. On the 13th, the squadron was tasked with destroying a bridge near Clare, which itself is just north of Rouen. That day, the squadron scored 4 hits and near misses on the target. Flying Officer Gilbert would go on to shoot down 2 enemy aircraft with the unit and thankfully survive the war. On the 28th of May, Flying Officer Scarlett took controls of MK356 on a fighter sweep near Paris, led by the CO, Squadron Leader MacLeod. While flying near the French capital, some aircraft were spotted, but due to heavy flak around the area, no combat took place. Again, Flying Officer Scarlett is someone I couldn't find much information about other than he made no claims while with 443 Squadron and seems to have survived the war. If you have any additional information about any of these pilots, please leave a nice long comment and help the video spread further. Another Canadian pilot who took control of the now famous MK356 was Flying Officer Ferguson. He flew this Spitfire on a fighter sweep in the Amiens-Paris sector 3 days before D-Day. According to the ORB, the mission was a bit of a cock-up. While 12 aircraft had been prepared for the mission, one was left sitting on the ground as Flying Officer Irwin couldn't get the engine going. Another 2 returned early because they had issues with their jet tanks, and another also returned early as he got mixed up during takeoff and couldn't catch up. It's unclear from the records who these last 3 pilots were, so Ferguson may only have had a short spin in MK356. This pilot also made no claims while with the unit, and happily his name does not appear in the Roll of Honour to the fallen. The same cannot be said for the next 2 pilots to take control of MK356. Flying Officer W.J. Bentley is the only wartime pilot to experience any significant engine issues with this Spitfire. On the 2nd of June, the squadron launched a fighter sweep that took them to Ghent and Bruges, where they attacked German vehicles. However, Bentley failed to take off. Evidently, the issue was only minor, as Flying Officer Ferguson was airborne in the same aircraft the next day. On the 12th of August, Bentley was taking part in an armed recce over the Lisieux area when he suffered engine failure. Forced to bail out, his parachute caught on the tail of his Spitfire, and he went in with the aircraft near Bernay. Flying Officer Bentley had been serving on an operational squadron since July 1941. He completed his first tour with 152, 65 and 249 squadrons between this date and April 1943. Joining 443 Squadron in May 1944, he would claim a 109 on the 30th of July. Another former pilot of MK356 who would meet an even more tragic end was Flying Officer A.J. Horrell. This young pilot would take control of the BBMF Spitfire for 3 sorties. The first was on the 24th of May 1944 when the squadron conducted an escort mission to Dieppe. In the ORB, which is incredibly difficult to read, it mentions that Flying Officer Horrell was finally back on the squadron's strength after a non-accepted posting to 61 OTU had been rescinded. Horrell had joined the squadron in May 1943, so may have been due for a break from ops. It's unclear who didn't accept the posting. Horrell was back in the air the next day, which was 80 years to the day of the fatal crash of MK356 in Lincolnshire. The third and final flight taken by Flying Officer Horrell in the recently crashed BBMF Spitfire was on D-Day itself. At 1945 hours, 12 Spitfires, led by Squadron Leader MacLeod, headed for the invasion beaches. The squadron had flown 4 missions that day, and this final excursion was very much like the others. No enemy aircraft were sighted, but the ORB reports that gliders had been seen landing and a tank engagement west of Caen was in progress. Just over 4 months later, on the 11th of October, Horrell had been tasked for the rather mundane mission of collecting a Spitfire from Antwerp. Flying Officer Pichet had an equally boring task of organising billets for the squadron's personnel on leave when in Brussels. The 2 pilots had been given command of an Oster 3, which belonged to the wing and was used for communication flights such as these. Pichet was to drop Horrell off at Antwerp before continuing to Brussels to complete his own mission. What happened on that flight exactly is unclear. What is known is that a burnt-out wreck was found near Deurne. The Oster had evidently wandered over German lines, had been shot down by flak or possibly by a fighter. What the 2 pilots were doing so far east is anyone's guess. MK356 was to be flown on 2 D-Day sorties, the earlier mission being conducted by Flying Officer Ockenden. Gordon or Gord Ockenden was from Alberta and joined 443 Squadron in February 1944. Ockenden certainly flew MK356 more than any other pilot and flew the Spitfire on its first operational sorties. He was also to fly the aircraft on an escort mission to Charleroi on the 10th of May, a Noble strike on the 27th, and another dive bombing mission targeting radar installations 2 days before D-Day. At 11:25 on the 6th of June, Ockenden joined 11 other Spitfires for a 2-hour patrol over the Seine estuary, where they saw absolutely no enemy aircraft. Not even any flak. All that was noted in the ORB was that the ground troops seemed to be making steady progress inland. On the 7th of June, Ockenden shared in the destruction of a 109 with Flight Lieutenant Russell. I've seen it suggested on some official sites that this was carried out while Ockenden was flying MK356, aka 2 Item Victor. In fact, Ockenden had been flying 2 Item Uncle on that sortie, so it would appear that MK356 never damaged any German aircraft in the air, which, let's face it, would make it even more of a treasure that we've just lost. Ockenden's other 3 sorties in the BBMF Spitfire were fairly uneventful, but in a rather British-Canadian way. On the 10th, the squadron was up again for a low-level sweep over the beachhead. While there were no enemy aircraft in the air and no flak near Le Havre, the formation were attacked by thunderbolts and lightning, but apparently it wasn't very frightening, as the only comment in the ORB is no consequences. For whom is my question. His 2 sorties on the 12th of June, one in the morning before Flight Lieutenant Russell flew the aircraft and one in the afternoon after, were both uneventful. Then it was Flying Officer T.G. Munro's turn. Munro took control of MK356 on the evening of the 13th of June and flew a patrol with the squadron over Utah Beach. As you may have guessed, there was nothing doing during the 2-hour mission. The next day, Munro experienced a small disaster when taking off. One of the Spitfire's tyres came off, and this meant that he had to attempt a belly landing when he returned to the airfield. This he did with professional skill, as MK356 was declared Category A and was later collected for repair by a field unit after the squadron had moved forward with the advance. MK356 would not return to combat, but the very same day its replacement, MK300, arrived and was nearly christened 2 Item Victor and was flown extensively by Gord Ockenden. The next day, the 15th of June, 443 Squadron moved to a forward base in France. So any picture you see of 2 Item Victor in La Belle France is MK300 and not MK356. However, the most confusing thing for a researcher was that in the ORB, the damaged Spitfire was noted down as MK366. This Spitfire did exist, but it was never on the strength of 443 Squadron. So I, as other people before me, had to conclude that this was a simple clerical error made at the time. Munro, however, would return to combat, and to his peril. He had been attached to the squadron since July 1943, yet he made no claims over any enemy aircraft. During an armed recce on the 25th of July, he was forced to bail out and taken prisoner. Interestingly, he never made it to a prisoner of war camp. Receiving wounds during the combat that led to his loss, he would die in December 1945. So how did MK356 get from a belly landing in a field near Ford to the Battle of Britain Memorial hangar at RAF Coningsby? Repaired, the aircraft was then attached to 83 Group Support Unit from August 1944 before being handed over to No. 1 School of Technical Training at RAF Halton in October 1945. Here, it was used as an instructional airframe and given a new serial number 5690M. 6 years later, it was sent to RAF Hawkinge to serve as a gate guardian. A decade after this, the airframe underwent some restoration before being stuck on a pole at RAF Locking, where it stood for 6 years before finding a new life with the Battle of Britain Film Unit at RAF Henlow in October 1967. After its silver screen debut, the aircraft joined the RAF Museum Reserve Collection based at RAF St Athan, where it was restored over an 8-year period. She finally took flight again on November the 7th, 1997. Recognised again as MK356, the aircraft was accepted by the Battle of Britain Memorial flight the following week. The aircraft was then presented as a clipped wing LF Mark 9 and painted in the only markings it ever wore in operations, 2 Item Victor. However, over the years, as with all of the BBMF collection, MK356 has sported other paint schemes, the latest being that of 92 Squadron Queen Johnny 3 when it operated in the desert. Did I mention anything you didn't know already? If so, please give the video a like and consider clicking the subscribe button to see what other videos I'll be releasing in the future. Again, I just want to extend my deepest condolences to the families of all the RAF pilots who flew MK356 and didn't make it home, in particular our latest loss on the 25th of May 2024. I really hope that MK356 can be rescued from the scrap heap and that we will see her take to the air again to continue honouring the men who fought in her all those summers ago.